You're good.
No. Oh, wow. And pass me a Modelo.
Good.
I get it.
Wait, that's Southern?
What?
Is that Southern?
Southern?
Yeah. South, this thing?
Deep. Yeah.
Need a few minutes to recover. So, hi, U of Perm West. Shout out to you. Feel weird saying the same exact thing over, because then I feel like it's scripted.
The
But
video wasn't working.
as I was looking at your red carpet photo shoot, I came across a quote from one of your songs that is the essence of the Chabura tonight, so I wanted to give you a shout out. Today I take my own advice and make the most of it. Too many times my choices have been guided by my fears. I'm not sure what song that's in, but it was on your website, so I take it as from one of your songs. All right. Thank you to Isaac, to Michael, to Ayal, to Benji. I assume you live here too.
I do.
Thank you for hosting. It's an honor to give a Chabura again. I like to
First time's
only.
charm.
This is the second time.
Third time.
Yeah.
Count Shavuos.
Okay. I like to give Chaburas at the U because it's a place of usually where people like to just sit around and talk about ideas, some deeper than others, but I feel like it's a place where anything I teach or anything I speak out of people is usually something that I feel myself, and I usually feel that it's well received because other people are usually feeling similar things, especially around the times of the holidays. This holiday being Rosh Hashanah, try to like quiet down all the external, ideas of Rosh Hashanah and try to hone in on the essence of the day and what we're trying to do and how we're trying to prepare for it. So that's why I really enjoy giving Chaburas here, and thank you for all the hosts. So I was thinking that ever since I heard the idea that chait doesn't actually mean sin, but it means, or at least one of the meanings of it is to miss the mark, it transformed, at least intellectually, the notion of all the times that I've sinned and will sin, from something very, very negative to not as negative, not even negative, because it really takes a myriad of, failures and not living up to expectations and really brings it together under one banner, and that's just missing the mark. It's not missing 100 marks, it's missing the mark. And tonight is hopefully just an exploration of what the mark is that we're missing. That specific point that we kind of like veer off of, that leads to a lot of other seemingly negative things that go on in our life, especially when it comes to sinning and not acting in accordance with the Torah and what God seemingly wants from us. So when it comes to sins, when we focus on our sins, we think of chait as sin, then that notion really impedes us from moving forward. And Rosh Hashanah, the whole idea of a New Year's resolution, there's some truth to even like the secular New Year's resolution, is that you just want to move forward. Whatever you're doing, whatever you've done, you just want to move forward. You want to start new. You want to start fresh. You want to, take what you did last year and just move forward with it. But when you have 1,000, things that you did wrong, it's very hard for a person to move on and to move forward. It's just fact. If you're driving on a highway and there's 1,000 stop signs, it almost will feel like you're not making any progress. Whereas if, there are no stop signs, the highway, you're just going. And when we think of things in terms of how much I sinned and how much I did wrong, and we put up these imaginary walls, these facades that aren't really there, and it becomes increasingly more difficult to remind ourselves that we created impediments that aren't there in our lives. So the question is, how do we move on? How do we move forward? How do we take, intellectually, it's like, okay, we just said that what the problem is, and now we kind of said the solution, but that's on a very intellectual level. How do emotionally we take it forward? How do we move past, the year and really begin anew? So the first source from Rav Kook, it's an essay called Hapachad, the fear. There's a few essays, ideas, Torahs that at least I personally keep with me always, and I always learn and I always read because no matter what stage I am in life, they always have tremendous meaning, and this is one of them. And here we'll begin to try to uncover how do we move past those impediments that we put up in front of ourselves that kind of make every year or every Rosh Hashanah feel like I'm here again, versus every Rosh Hashanah feel like a very happy and joyous, I'm here again, move forward. Whereas we feel like I'm here again, I suck. So, Hapachad hanifraz hu notel aziv achayim, shel ha'adam v'shel kol ha'chayim margish, ein davar ra v'achzari ba'olam doma lo. The all over the place fear, the worry and the anxiety that grabs hold of the splendor of life, of a person's life, really remove it. Notel means to grab and take away. Takes away the shine, the brightness from a person's life, and any feeling that he has in life. There's nothing worse and nothing more cruel in the world than this. Hu magdil et kol haros yoser boin oruch mimashahem, and it grows all the bad things in our life much more than they actually are. It expands them and it makes them seem that they're much bigger. Hamafil zohar kol hatovos, it dampens it lowers the brightness of all that is good. V'chatiraso asher yachtor mitachas la'ash shivosehem l'hagazim shisha svona ra tachas hatov hagalui. And even on the outside, if there's something good, there's always in our mind that underlying fear would be the opposite of a silver lining. I don't know, what's the opposite of silver? Bronze? Dirt? Whatever is the opposite of silver, it's the anti-silver lining. No matter what happens good in our life, there's something that's beneath that's always holding back our enjoyment of something positive in our life. Mekor kol chalasha v'kol rifyon chamori musari v'sichli hu rak hapachad ha'over es gvulo. The root of man's weakness in his materialism, in his ethical behavior, in his intellectual prowess, only comes from a fear, from an anxiety that spills over its borders, its boundaries. Hu ya'im al adam shelo yasa kol davar l'shivasa. It makes a man feel that he has no power to do anything about it. He's paralyzed. Shelo yinakef etzba lahatzalaso shema yinazek shema yavi alav ra lo yuchal kapara. To the point that he feels that if he would actually try to do something, he would only make things worse. He wouldn't actually have the solution. What he thinks is the solution will only bring about more pain and more suffering and more anxiety and more worry. Ad shehu oseh lachalesh malei rifyon, ad shematzalos v'efes ma'aseh hu nofa b'chora. Until he's so weak, and we'll see in the next paragraph what that weakness actually is. Ad shematzalos v'efes ma'aseh hu nofa b'chora. That he kind of like feels like this is who I am. There's no out. You know, you walk around with that cloud over your head. There's nothing doing. There's that scene in Good Will Hunting where Will is going for job interviews, and they're talking, and like he's like being offered like, or he's talking about like if he would work for NASA, then he would program a code that would ultimately unlock a missile that would launch and kill some random villager in Afghanistan or wherever, you know, one of the countries in the Middle East that he doesn't know, and he's the ultimate cause of that. Outside of the fact that, you know, he, in the context of like, not talking about who's good, who's evil, who's bad, you know, he doesn't take jobs, he doesn't move on in his life. This guy's a genius. Why? Because that's the thought that balloons in his mind. That he's going to do X, which leads to Y, which leads to Z, which leads back to A, B, C, so I'm not doing that. Versus almost living in the moment, hey, here's a good job for you, you can succeed at this, use your ability to succeed at this. But what does he do? He thinks 8 steps ahead. He thinks 8 steps in one. And that paralyzes him from any actual action. And Rav Kook is saying that this is the worst type of, you know, thing to come upon man, is when he floods his mind with 1,000 thoughts. Starts with one, and that seed grows and grows until you have a tree of worries, a tree of, you know, that all started from one maybe suffake worry, that if you would have just moved on or taken the job or whatever, the tree never would have been planted. And once a tree is planted, it's very hard to uproot that tree.
It's better not to think.
So we're going to see, especially the end of this piece, but also in the Derech HaMelech, it's more focusing your thought versus having 1,001 thoughts. If you have 1,001 thoughts, you're not connecting to your personal like essence. So in that case, you're building a forest, but you're not planting the one seed that actually matters. So you have a nice lush forest, but the one plant that actually mattered never got planted. And when we're thinking about Chet and the idea of missing the mark and the idea of Rosh Hashanah, of renewal, of, you know, the eternal renewal that is Rosh Hashanah, when we think of our sins as 1,000 sins versus just I missed a certain mark, or I got off of my essence a little bit, which we'll see our essence, God's essence, you know, aligning because it's really one. Then we think like, what am I going to do in life? I have 99 problems, you know. So we'll just read a little more. In the Rav Kook, you could read the whole thing, but it's a little lengthy. Maybe we will.
Is Joey still there on the phone?
Maybe.
Sure.
He's in St. Louis. He left us. This fear that we've been talking about is a totally intellectual, mental fear. Shemati al dimyon hakozev al hachelik hayoser adin v'yoser mefuar min ha'enoshi. It takes hold of our imagination, and kozev, there's no good English word for kozev, brazen, but like, who uses the word brazen? And it like continuously like hits away at the adin is the very delicate part of us. Mefuar. So I looked up the word mefuar. You know, usually means like exalted or splendid, but there's an actual definition is distilled. A very distilled the very distilled part of, the very delicate and distilled part of the human being. Shehem omdim lanes. And it stands, not, for first I thought it was like a miracle, and I was like trying to figure out how that worked, but it stands to be against. Lihios laorot mashirin es darchei achayim el haklal kula. To really Hanam holchim tamei beikos haoros lafi mashe yigdal kishrono shel adam lahavinu lahaskil. And it's like beating down on our delicate and pure and distilled part of ourselves, and it's constantly attaching itself to the heels, to the coattails of the light that is in our life, that the goodness that's in our life. It's that like little voice in the back. Kain hu gadol pachto amaduma mefu'alas hamachshava. Yosem mikol am hachonim lahaskel lachshol machshavos. Ofen mechanes umkasher es kol pizor benifrad shebeniska v'kadosh l'chativa achas koleles be'etzo v'das v'dvarim ha'omdim b'romo sha'olam hu am Yisrael. And it really attacks the Jewish people who represent this kolel, this unified, the way that there's like almost like humanity, and then there's the Jewish people who represent kind of like the wholeness. They contain everything of humanity, and it really attempts to break up that oneness of the world. There's like a oneness, everything is interconnected, and this anxiety, by working on each individual to make him inevitably, we'll skip down and just summarize right now, inevitably remove him from the klal and to see himself as a prat, ultimately causes him to now see everything in his life as a separate, inconsequential action, versus an interconnected, much like the example used whenever, in Rav Kook, but whenever people learn Rav Kook is just rooted in Chassidus and Kabbalah, is the idea of a body. A body is one whole unit. Everything works together. If you take away one part of the body, it stops working, and unless fixed, will cause everything else to stop working. You cut off your finger, so this part of the finger is worthless, and if you don't treat it, you'll bleed out, and the rest of your body will cease to function normally until you die. So this fear, this anxiety, this worry. So I always thought it was like an anxiety, and then I gave this to Dr. Pelkovitz, who's a psychologist, and he termed it as worry. This is a worry. So I don't know if there's a difference between anxiety and worry, but we use both. It not only its main function is to separate man from a higher purpose, from what he's actually doing, what his goal is, and what his mission is, and his purpose, his own personal purpose in the whole. And when he does that, then we start to look at everything as a specific action versus a collective action, and ultimately, coming back to our sins, we start to see the sins pile up, and our job in Rosh Hashanah of moving forward now becomes increasingly hard. The Alter Rebbe said in his Igeres HaTshuva that the main focus of a person needs to be to move on, and then eventually you come back when you've already moved on and you've built that foundation, you're solid, and you can come back and see, okay, when I did this wrong, this is why, or this is how, or this is, and then work that back into you. But if you're constantly focusing on these little things that I did wrong, which are in a way kind of don't matter in the grand scheme of things, then it causes you to actually miss the whole purpose that there's a purpose to what I'm doing. There's an actual purpose to what I'm doing. There's a light that I'm supposed to bring to the world that is dim now because I'm focusing on so many other things. So just focus on the essence. Focus on your essence. What you are supposed to be doing, and work from there. Don't focus on the 800 things you did wrong, because that's not you. It's not. So skip down to, it's kind of where it gets bigger. You see where it clearly was like taped. So the line up, it says Hahatzala. So what's the Hatzala? What's the salvation for the luck, for getting over this weakness of ours that causes us to kind of be overly anxious over imaginary concerns? Hatzala hayoser nichbada la'amenu le'es kazos hi hasaras hapachad hadimyoni harechuvo mitoch halev, to remove that imaginary fear from your heart, l'haroso barer kishemesh, and to see things as clear as the sun. She'ein lo klal v'klal mimale pachad. There's nothing actually to be worried about. Yifchadu ha'amim ha'mishalim be'lilim. And here he goes on to kind of like describe that, you know, the nations of the world, it's their way to worry about things that are, you know, imaginary, but the Jewish people, he's like, what is it a Jew's business to worry about that? He has to focus on one thing, bringing like the light of God to the world, the oneness of God. And when you're focusing on that, these other things that are inevitable, sinning is inevitable, won't cause a person to like be so worried that like he can't do something positive in the world, or he's not doing something positive in the world. Well, for now, we'll just skip over that distinction between nations and Jews, and because ultimately there's a very deep universal theme here as well. But the last paragraph, Ba'achar Sayamim, B'Ichson D'Shicha, it's the next paragraph. She'ha'ora ha'lokas hi omedes achar kislenu. Hine reishis kol ha'chsherim hi hasaras ha'pachad ha'odef shal machshava mitoch ha'nefesh ha'klolis. V'yichud mitoch nafshoseim shal ha'yechidim ha'mitzuyanim ha'chanunim b'seichel tov b'kishron shal kedusha v'tzedek v'heim hanam yoser nilakim b'pachad v'cholosha. In the end of days, even the people who were immune to this like fear and anxiety for whatever reason, social, political, economic, coolness, whatever it was, like everyone's gonna have it. Everyone's gonna experience this fear, this anxiety, this worry about how do I move on in life. I'm not doing anything positive in life. I have no redeeming qualities. And it might be a generalization, but I think we're in a pretty well described time by Rav Kook now, where even people who 30, 40 years ago would never have felt, you know, worthlessness in their life, are feeling a deep sense of worthlessness and lack of meaning in life. And as he says, this is part of the last generation before Mashiach. And I have no doubt, as what he's going to say next, that because of the Mashiach, when he made a reference before that the fear grabs at the heels of the good in our life and acts as that underlying, that anti-silver lining, we have to flip it around in the end of days at the Akev, where the anti-silver lining is now the surface. Underneath that is the goodness and is the light and is life itself, the feeling of life. And he says, "Hadechifa lazeh hi ayidei hakoach hafachi." It comes, the strength comes, the pull comes from the power of opposites. Koach hachutzba shehuchach lizgaber beis hazos shebamakom shemizgala ein sham shum pachad. One way it works is when you finally realize that everything you've been fearing up until now, there's nothing to fear. The exact opposite is true. And what on the surface seems like a very dire situation is really the exact opposite. It requires just a little removal of the dirt on top to reveal the exact opposite of what it actually is. And whatever we're feeling, it's definitely an interesting thing to think about on a broad level of like, could make you a little crazy. Is everything like I'm feeling that's negative really is the opposite. and how do I? Okay, so feeling this, that means there's an equal and opposite. And he says that afal pi sheba mitzad hashafal mitzad hashichron v'amahuma harachok kirachok shemayim haaretz me'osa hagavura haba mibircha shemayim shel osher hanishama v'chezkas tzedakasa kol makom hu poa b'kocho ha'oz lakachas mimenu es hachelek hatov. It might seem like the distance between heaven and earth to dismiss that fear that I keep like repeating the same things just because I'm there's like an essential term or word that I feel like would hit it, but I can't think of it. As nitzotze, all it's trying to do is diminish the good in our life. That's the whole purpose of this pachat hanifraz, this worry that is all over the place. It's 1,000-thought worry. Its only purpose is to take all the good things in our life and make them bad, or make us think that they're bad. You start second guessing any good deed or whatever you're going to do for someone. What do you want? Beer? You can speak up.
That's the order.
So as a ponim hayoser tochi, its whole purpose is to attack our inner essence, our inner self. Minias hapachat hamachshavi mipnei haoz hamuftach hatzafon ba'otzer chayenu. Va'az tikave hagevura b'mishbetzet hakedusha v'machshava tafriach. This imaginary, this dimyon fear that's in our mind, all it wants to do is plant itself and grow like a cancer. And that means that fighting it with the koach ha'hafachi means that when that's there, there's limitless ability to turn that into positive and good. Because in reality it is, and the stronger the pull is to keep you in that narrow, that tunnel, there's an equal and opposite force of this is good. So just to bring it back for a second to what we started, what we're, Rosh Hashanah, we sinned, So the more we sin, the worse we sin. Now that it's now that we're thinking back on it, is not a testament to how bad I am, but it's a testament to how good I am, but the potential that's laden underneath all the bad. That all it requires is a little street cleaning, and it's revealed that in the end of days, is a big theme in Rav Kook as well, is that the lowest is really the highest. The highest is really the lowest. And we have to believe it. Just like this fear comes and implants it in our mind and causes us to believe something that's not there, we have to remind ourselves to believe what actually is there. And this comes from not zeroing in on what our inner voice is. That's a whole nother discussion of how to figure that out. But when we lose that focus on that and focus on a million other things, then it paralyzes us. We sometimes think if I'm a jack of all trades, then I'll be a superstar. But in reality, you become a master of none, and that only really affects you. It doesn't necessarily affect anyone else. It could, but the person who it affects the most is you. And ultimately, we have to realize that the inner voice of getting connected into that, our personal voice, is really also connecting to, the actual inner voice of the world, of God Himself. Our Anochi, our I, is His I. And I just want to, it's not a tangent for the moment, not a tangent necessarily, but I saw this amazing thing this week, because this whole thing is about quieting our, 1,000 thoughts that build up in our mind and focus on the main Iker thought of I'm good, I do good, positive. Then there was this philosopher, Max Picard, as you see, he's a Swiss Catholic, who wrote a book called Hitler and Ourselves, some translated Hitler in Ourselves. It's a very powerful book. It's short. It's a little audacious in the claim that he makes, just because using the term Hitler always comes with a lot of baggage. But he says something amazing. By contrast, another philosopher regarded silence as positive. Multiple in its manifestations, the silence of which he writes is joined mystically to the processes of creation and creativity, to spiritual renovation and to prayer. Picard's silence seems more akin to mystical silence. Silence, he believes, is the antidote to the noisy turmoil of disharmony and war distracting us from our spiritual focus, crowding out the inner space in which we would now our own mind rather, and being subsumed into the collective swirl. Picard argues that it was not silent complicity, but frenzied commotion that allowed Hitler's successes. Amid the bustle of modern machine-age living, Picard suggests it became harder for human beings to listen to themselves, their hearts, their thoughts, their consciences, their quiet but consistent communications from the divine and eternal. People cannot often discern the thin, small voice, the Kol D'Mamadaka, or what rabbinic tradition elsewhere terms the Bas Kol, the daughter of the voice of God. So I never thought of Bas Kol as that, as like in the erotic imagery of the daughter of God. But when you understand, so he's making Rav Kook makes this point in here, but it was a little more clear in here that lost in the commotion of the last generation before Mashiach is our hearts, our thoughts, our consciences, and our quiet, consistent communications from the divine. And when we zone in on that inner voice of ours, the daughter of the voice of God, then we're connecting ourselves to God Himself. Because ultimately, the way we were created was Vayipach ba'apo nishmas chayim. God Himself blew into us His breath. So connecting to our own inner voice is kind of a way of moving back up the pendulum or whatever, the totem pole or whatever. This is an idea that I love, and it's the idea that God gave us and sustains us, everything we're doing is climbing back up the slide. Those water park slides that are encased. So we're shot down. It's very hard to get back up, but you gotta get back, that's why they give you stairs.
Toboggan ride.
But no, the ones that are, whatever, use any water example.
Anything on a slope.
And in a way, channeling our Kol D'Mamadaka, our Kol D'Mamadaka, not God's Kol D'Mamadaka, in reality channels the divine voice within us. And come Rosh Hashanah time, when I sinned, but who am I? Who do I want to be? Clarifying that is much more beneficial, helpful, positive, real than anything else. And that reattaches us to the divine in us, which ultimately will reattach us to the divine in everything. Okay? I'm not done, but just want to say because I'm parched, so I'm sure beer.
You can get the shofar.
We're getting there.
Oh.
Wouldn't bring the shofar in the middle, the shofar is the end. So at this point, I'd like to inaugurate the Joey Rosenfeld source of deeper meaning. That I hope for future chaburas, whatever, however deep the sources you're getting, you could either go to him. We were talking about the idea and he mentioned this piece. So you could go to him, talk it over, just get it a source from him, or you could bring it a level deeper. So I'm inaugurating the Joey Rosenfeld source of deeper meaning. And today is from the Piazetzna.
Some kind of background music.
So I was trying to figure out how to, because usually it's like the Adam Friedman chair of, of whatever.
Colonel Adam Friedman.
Okay, Colonel Yechiel, Jehiel. So I was trying to figure out the right wording. So we'll come, eventually the program has been initiated. The name, we're still looking for that donor. Money talks here, Landy's money talks.
Not for profit.
So this piece, Inyan Hashkata, is really like we call it a meditative guide from the Piazetzna. Kind of lays out what you should do to quiet your mind, because ultimately that's what the Rav Kook was talking about. The Nifraz is 1,000 thoughts. You build up. You think 8 thoughts in one, you can't move on. You think one thought, you can move, and then you move to the next one, to the next one. So how do we quiet that? So he says an amazing thing, and he really connects it fully to. I was kind of making the drush of us to God, but he really says it pretty strongly. So skip that first paragraph, because I think that's just saying the guys. I'm trying to remember what he said. This is a chassid writing what he remembers the Piazetzna saying, not the Piazetzna himself. So pick up by Admor Zatzallah. התחיל אז במאמר חז"ל, חלום אחד משישים בנבואה, כנודק דרכו של אדמו"ר בספריו, כי הישוש של האדם הוא המסנגד להשראה ממרום. A person's yeshus, I only know it as yesh, but a person's existence, his physical existence, his reality, gets in the way, is counter to the resting of the divine presence. Tangentially, I heard an amazing riff, two Chabadskers, that was for bringing for El Chayil. I was sitting around, we were sitting around for bringing, we were a few hours in, so a few hours and a few bottles in, and one guy's telling us that he doesn't, someone mentioned do we sing Arba Bavos, and he's only if you went to the mikvah, and then he starts saying I used to go to the mikvah, whatever, and another guy who looked like he was dead pipes up and goes, it's because you're such a yesh, and then goes back down. I was wow, really using Chabad philosophy to just rip, but I thought it was funny. So our yeshus gets in the way, and if our thoughts and our mind is awake, as kasha shetishra alav hashras mimarim, then it's hard for us to get something from above. Adam, and just to go back for a second before we move on to that Goodwill Hunting example, everything he was thinking about was laced with I. I don't know if I don't remember the exact, maybe we'll pull it up on the big screen. Maybe implement that into the chaburas from now on. Big screen, He everything is something he did. I, and that affects everyone else, but it's I. So the I gets in the way of everything. Adam yashan v'daiso machshavso shoktim as davka kevan she'ein lo as das la'atzmo efshar shetishra alav hashra mimarim v'zeh inyan chalom echad. So when a person's asleep, his mind's at ease, so he's able to have a hashra from above, and that's what dreams are. That's why dreams are one part nevuah. because his mind is quieted. That's why it's also hard to fall asleep when you have 1,000, a million thoughts. And like Viktor Frankl writes in Masters for Meaning that the way that he got told people to fall asleep was to focus on one thought. I don't remember if it was the actual thought that was bothering them or some other thought, but to focus on one thought, and eventually you'll get tired and you'll fall asleep. But if you're racing around to 1,000 thoughts, you'll never fall asleep. As anyone who doesn't fall asleep knows.
Suffers from insomnia.
Kenoda gam amaro sha'admor al masha yoser misorim betfila me'asher b'torah ki b'torah mishtam shem yoser im hanochis hainu ichler. That's why tefillah is like on a higher level than learning, because learning involves you. It involves the I. I learn. I ask you a question. I do this. Whereas tefillah requires bittul. Requires you to just nullify yourself completely to the prayer, even when you're saying like I need X or I need Y. You're relying totally on something outside of you. When you're learning, I had a good chiddush, or I had a good chap, or I was machave, and Baruch shekivanti. This is like a sick blessing to give yourself. It's like, it's a sick blessing. Sick. Aval b'tefillah lehefech ha'ikar hu habitul ba. Tefillah is the opposite. You might ask for things for yourself, but you're totally relying on something outside of you. Aval be'esh ha'ish yashan az I efshar lo lirtzos davar maki halo yashanu. But when a person is asleep, then it's impossible for him to want anything, to want anything, to like be anything, because isn't this what sleep is? And the main thing is to be asleep while you're awake. Usually you hear the opposite, like where people are sleepwalking. So I term this positive sleepwalking. To be quiet when you're asleep, when you're awake. To like you're awake, but you're like, it's like real consciousness of the situation, of the matter at hand. So that's a level that it's hainu b'hashkatas mashvasa v'ritzono hashotzim ba'adam l'bli kates ki kach darka shal machshava shemistaleches zu bazu v'kasha lo la'adam lifrosh behen. A person needs to quiet his mind, otherwise he'll drown in his thoughts. His thoughts will literally sink him to the bottom. So skip just to the next, where the next paragraph begins, and he gives a little eitzah. V'diber az sheyatchel ha'ish lahabit al machshavosav sha'a kala la'arech ezer regayim hainu ma'ani choshev. So what does he suggest? The person should take a few minutes, think about ma'ani choshev, think about what I'm thinking about. Take a few minutes, whatever it is, set aside a time to think about your thoughts. And that's the time when you could have 1,000 thoughts, you're going to think about your thoughts. And only at that time. Az yargish la'ala'at, sherosho mitrukan machshava amdu mishpatan hergel. ואז יתחיל לומר פסוק אחד כגון השם אלוקים אמת כדי לקשר עכשיו ראשו החלל משאר מחשבות למחשבה אחת של קדושה. Ultimately, you'll start to like get rid of the extraneous thoughts. You start to zero in on thoughts that matter, and you'll start to fill all your thoughts with holiness, because they'll take on meaning and purpose. Afterwards, you'll ask what you need. And then you'll start to ask for things that you actually need versus things that you want. Omer b'lashon hakodesh, switches to Yiddish. Isaac, would you want to read our Yiddish?
Please.
He translates it into Hebrew. Ich bin mamin be'emunah shlema Als der Eberster is der einziger Nimtza auf der Welt. When I believe with my whole heart that God himself is the only, I don't know, but einziger is the only only thing like in the world. Let's see if we got that right with the Hebrew. Yeah, Nimtza Yechidi Ba'olam. I think in the last Chabur I gave also there was Yiddish. In alt was es is the ein, the in ear is nar haras Hashem. I did? Okay, so we'll go to the Hebrew because
I actually was understanding Yiddish better than I was understanding. That's a problem.
the in, well, it's Lashon HaKodesh, you know, Yiddish. Ein shom mitzias also there's no other existence outside of him. V'chol ha'olam, v'chol asher bo, heim rak ha'aras or Hashem. And everything in the world is really just ha'aras or Hashem, the light of God. V'kach shinen eze pa'amim, here says an amazing thing, v'kach shinen eze pa'amim, repeat this many times, aval lo sheyomer zos b'chazaka, but don't say it with strength or with vigor. Ki kol ha'inyan hu rak hashkit, the whole purpose is to quiet your mind, to quiet hashkit machshavaso. V'amiras b'tokef yochel hu rak la'orer es ha'anochias, shelo rak adra b'ofen kal mod. What will you do? You'll be saying Ani Ma'amim B'nai Shalema, you'll say it loud, you'll say it proud,
Close to that.
but all you'll end up doing is waking up that I that's counter to God's I. And which we said in the beginning keeps away the Hashra from above from coming upon us. More Yiddish. So then he continues on, and he advocates for positive psychology. All this should be done. Any quieting of the mind, any thoughts that you think, and everything that you're thinking should only focus on the positive, not on the negative. And I think he gives the example of a baby's crying.
Is this in sync with psychology? I wonder.
This?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about psychology.
Yeah. This, like, what,
No,
in general, or
yeah,
this specific?
No, focusing on
Yeah. Well, it's a
like
branch.
negating all.
Well, there's a branch called positive psychology, which
Okay.
only focuses on strength. So for a class I was taking, I had to take a character strength test. And it lists everything in strengths. So something might be your 25th best strength, but it's your 25th best strength, not your number one negative trait. Like, it might be something you're so bad at, but it's your 25th most positive trait. And you work on it from that perspective. And statistics show that if you work on it from that perspective, then, and I'm only right now just regurgitating stuff that was in my class, not stuff that I found on my own, but statistics show that if you do it that way, you have a higher success rate of overcoming, working on that negative, that 25th best positive trait, and overcoming negative anxiety and negative stuff. Another awesome, I'll say one more stat that I saw was that in a relationship, healthy relationships should be based on a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 positive statements to 1 negative statement. And even the negative statement is really a positive statement. It's like, it shouldn't be like, you're awesome, you suck. It should be like a positive but negative statement. But there should at least be 5-to-1 ratio for a healthy, and this was done by a marital psychologist who, like, based on years of research, saw that like couples that had a 5-to-1.
It's like years of research and 4 divorces.
I mean, not his own personality, some guy, I don't know, this is, you know. So there is a whole branch of psychology that's based on the notion of focusing on the positive.
Cool.
And it's not even deflecting the negative, it's reassessing the negative, revaluing it. You know, it's not negative, it's just not as positive.
I had to take this class at work, and they basically said that it's so much
HR?
whatever. It's so hard to fix your problems. Just enhance your good parts. Like, focus on that. Like, spend your time focus your time enhancing what you're good at. And that'll sort of overcome your negative problems.
What if you have problems though?
You're so good at the good
Yeah,
stuff.
that people won't notice.
People won't notice
Yeah.
the fact that you.
Yeah, that's what they said.
Well, that has to do with
No,
something else.
Yeah.
I think
Go
that
drunk every day. Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. Just
Don't worry.
good at that.
You can
Yeah.
crunch numbers like
Yeah.
nobody.
I think ultimately,
self-delusion to it though, right?
Yeah.
Probably.
I think ultimately it like what that the purpose of that is the extreme focus on your positives will improve your negatives as well.
Yeah.
Whereas if you focus on the negatives, it will have a detrimental effect to the things you do well. There's a bigger upside to focusing on the things you do well for the things that you don't do as well than focusing on the things that you don't do as well for the things that you actually do well. And his advice here, which he takes in a little different direction, which is it's really the same as like the Rav Kook and this Max Picard, but is that we need to reduce our ego for the alter ego, which is God Himself, and quieting the myriad of thoughts that are in our mind all day, in order to hear the kol d'mamadaka of ourselves and of God, and that's especially important on Rosh Hashanah, because there's a lot that we could potentially look negatively on. And it seems to us there's a lot more to look down on than there is to look up on. But if we have one positive thing to look up on, it's more worth it to focus entirely on that than it is to focus on, quality over quantity. And now getting to the shofar. So I wrote this little note down because I saw it. Just go back two steps for a second. The Ramah actually, I think, brings the halacha that people should try to not sleep on Rosh Hashanah. To try to,
It's very hard.
to try not to sleep. Because ultimately,
You should also try to go to shul.
try your best.
Work on that one.
Because ultimately,
That's why it's okay after sleep.
as good as sleep was one 60th of Nevuah, it's also the opposite extreme of too many thoughts. Because there's actual, your mind's quiet and you could have Hashrash Hashchina or Hashrav Mimarum, but when you're asleep, there's an inability to do something with it. And on Rosh Hashanah, our whole goal is to focus on what's important and what we do good, and work off of that, not just have it like come upon us and do nothing with it. And the idea of not sleeping would fit in the sense that we actively are going to focus on the good and actively going to see how that is now going to be the focus of our life going forward, versus falling asleep and dreaming good, versus instead we're actually putting it into action and doing it. But now the shofar, so I was thinking, obviously Vayikach Ba'apa Nishmas Chaim is like a very important theme when it comes to the shofar, but before we connect it fully to our inner voice, to God's inner voice, I saw this cool thing in this book, Speaking Silences, from Sue Levi Elwell, also known as Rabbi Sue Levi Elwell of the Union of Reform Judaism. So she writes, might we be able, she says the shofar is all about listening, which it is. Might we be able, maybe for the first time, to listen to our own voices and hear our own truths? This echoes the Max Picard, what he was saying, which ultimately leads to like pretty destructive force of not listening and not listening to our inner voice. Our own voices, our own truths, for when we can hear our own breathing, our own heartbeats, the sound of our own blood pulsing through our veins, then we can begin to hear the essential humanity of those around us. Their cries and moans and laughter will no longer be muted by the cacophony of our daily lives. If we listen carefully and deliberately, we may, in the words of theologian Nell Morton, hear others in speech. Will we hear those around us who have been silent and silenced? Will we hear those who call for justice? So the shofar represents that actual singular, still voice. And it teaches us to listen for that in ourselves and listen for that in others. Because going back to the Rav Kook, ultimately we're that one body, and hearing ours is hearing theirs. And I was thinking that with the shofar, and any instrument for, but the shofar especially because it's a ritual object, you can only have one sound at a time. You can't have a tekiah and a trua together. You can't. It's impossible. Which we know the only person it's possible to have two sounds at once is God Himself. Shomer v'zochar b'dibur echad. It was said in one breath. Something which is impossible for man. So I was thinking just that the shofar is our way of tapping in and reconnecting back up to God Himself and to that nekuda panimi of the entirety of creation and of humanity is by engaging in an activity that ultimately it's only one sound, but you're blowing, all the sounds are together. A tekiah without the shwarm and the trua, and the tekiah, or the tekiah without the shwarm and the tekiah, is worthless. It needs to, you have to have all the 9 sounds. So yes, at one time you're only hearing one sound, but in a way, it's reenacting that singular sound that only God Himself can produce. Because when we connect to our own individual sound, we're connecting to that nekuda panimi, that neshama kolelis, that pulsating throughout creation that we all too often disregard. And on Rosh Hashanah, this Rosh Hashanah, we should merit to see it in a revealed way, that it comes out that our inner essence is everyone's inner essence, is ultimately God's essence, and focus on the good and not the bad, and hopefully we'll be back next year. Excited. Thank you. Namaste. L'chaim. You're now all implicated. What should I click?
Do a red button.